I'm super honored to have with me the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who's the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, as well as the co-chair of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response for this first live episode. Come on over. Thank you so much, Helen, for joining us for this podcast episode. So we generally talk about the week in global development for the podcast, and this week is WHA week, and it's also been such an historic week. We've witnessed the adoption of the a pandemic treaty, which was a historic moment, and I got to see, I think, a few hours right after that was adopted, you and Precious at a Graduate Institute event, and it was so nice to see you guys celebrating this moment. And as much as it's a momentous occasion and it's super important, the next questions are, what happens next? How do we make sure that this actually works? And this week, the panel released a report that kind of digs a little bit into that. Can you tell us some of your recommendations from that?
Greetings, everyone. Yes, I think as Richard Horton said at that event at the Graduate Institute, the approval of the text of the Pandemic Accord is the end of the beginning. So there's many more steps on this journey. But it's very important to end the beginning because it's been 3.5 years of hard negotiation in the making. So we have in effect, a framework convention under Article 19 of the WHO Constitution, which was what was recommended to the World Health Assembly by the independent panel set up to look at the international response exactly 4 years ago. So here we are, at end of the beginning. But of course, the pandemic agreement isn't going to be open for ratifications until the next stage. And the next stage is the negotiation of the Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing Annex. And the issues involved in that have been very controversial the last 3.5 years since the negotiation process began. The hope is that the negotiation on that annex could conclude by time for approval at WHA next year. That would then open the convention for ratification, and maybe within a year, if we really mobilise, you would see the treaty come into force with 60 ratifications. But you can see there's a lot of ifs and buts in this process, so there will be a need for those who really see the need to lock in all these new agreements to keep mobilised, because there's a number of benchmarks yet to meet, and the issues aren't easy.
Yeah, so in the report, you actually talk a little bit about financing, and I loved this wording here. I want to read it like word for word. This is like on the contents page. It says, invest now or pay a heavy price in the future. And you talk about investment for WHO particularly, and I think this has been a big issue during this World Health Assembly. How important is it to invest in WHO, and what other investments are needed?
If you go back to our independent panel May 2021 report, a key recommendation we made was that member states have to fund WHO to do its core job of standard setting, policy, normative, etc. It's got to be a resource for that. And we made a recommendation of maybe 2/3 of the base program, the core program of WHO, being funded by the member state assessed contributions. Now, that issue went into negotiation among member states later that year, and under the chairmanship of Björn Kummel, the German health diplomat, they actually reached agreement by around the end of 2022 from memory, and then probably went to the 2023 WHA, to shift the level of funding for the base program from literally 16% of assessed contributions up to 50%. But you then have to get the budget approved each biennium, and one of the things that's happened this week is that they did approve the scheduled 20% increase to keep in line with getting to 50% of the base program being funded by 2030-31. So, I mean, this is progress, but we're not there yet. And all I would say is that member states need to keep their word, as agreed 2 years ago, that they will make those gradual incremental shifts upwards in their core funding to enable WHO to do its job. Now, as we're all aware, there's a lot more to funding in the whole pandemic preparedness space than supporting the core program of WHO, and we can go into that because the financial cliff that global health faces at the moment is obviously quite severe. But for WHO, at least there's another notch in the belt on funding this week.
Yeah, speaking of that notch in the belt, I'm always like, but I don't want to be a pessimist, but I also witnessed Tedros celebrating that increase in contribution, but with the loss of funding, it still leaves a shortfall. And in this report, you also talk about simplifying the global health architecture, and I think that's so important right now because it feels like they're competing priorities and it feels like there needs to be better ways of coordinating and working together. What does that look like, a more simplified global health architecture? What does that look like?
So almost all these organisations and the architecture are set up by member states, and they've been set up in better times when there was more money. We have a number of vertical silos, and they're all doing great work, believe me. But when the money is more scarce, I think it is time for the member states to have an adult conversation again as to whether you need as many organisations. So what are the core functions that have to be performed, and then what is the form that would follow that? One of the concerns I have at the moment is that because every organisation's under pressure, everyone's making their cuts and their silos. What are we going to see drop through the cracks? Don't really know. So there's not really that overarching conversation at the moment. And I think Geneva's an obvious place for it to happen because so many of the entities concerned are here. But yeah, it's quite an urgent conversation, I think.
And you also mentioned the PABS annex, which is something that's still pending. We're hoping that that can be negotiated by next year's WHA. But I always have this question. I'm always like, it was 3 years of us discussing this. What needs to happen in the next year to actually come to an agreement? What do you think is that push that's needed to actually come to an agreement on this annex in particular? And why was it so controversial, just in case anyone doesn't know about it?
Well, it's about equity, isn't it? And that's been the core problem all the way from the time the pandemic struck and when we started, the world started to mobilise its responses. Some people were in a far better position to get the countermeasures they needed than others. And, we saw entire populations in high-income countries vaccinated before health workers in low-income contexts got any vaccine at all. So that's been at the heart of the problem. Now, you also had the rather searing experience of South Africa, which quickly and transparently reported the emergence of the Omicron variant, and for its pains had travel bans placed on it. And then the experience has been that when there's an outbreak somewhere in Africa, there tends to be almost a generic response. So the fact that Omicron was in South Africa, then people think, well, should I go to the game parks in Kenya? And it becomes debilitating for the entire continent, which of course is, why if you go back to the IHR, as they've been for a long time, they've never recommended travel bans because they tend to be a bit indiscriminate and sweeping. So what countries are saying is, look, if we're going to honestly and openly report, the deal has to be that then, we're not discriminated against in ways like that, but also that if we're making the pathogen sequencing, etc., available, we need to be able then to have access to the tests, vaccines, treatments, which are made possible because we put this information in the public arena. And as you may recall, in an earlier phase when these issues were being discussed through the INB, There was discussion about having a similar principle to that in I think the Biodiversity Convention, where there is some recompense for information supplied. So, I mean, these are very, very difficult issues, but I think we just have to keep an equity focus and lens on it. How can we, through the PABS Annex, provide for the most equitable response possible for the next time a pandemic threat emerges?
Definitely support that. I was a victim of the Omicron travel ban, so definitely also support that. But looking a little bit further ahead, what would you like to see in the lead up to the UN high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response? Lots of P's in there.
Yes. Well, in my humble opinion, the last high-level meeting was a bit of a damp squib. It could have done more to mobilise countries around the job that needed to be done here in Geneva. The next one, I think, could be much more strategic, and again, it will need members. It probably needs a Friends of the High-Level Meeting group to say, how do we get the most out of this? Now, what it aims to do will very much depend, I think, on where the member states here in Geneva get to on the PABS Annex. If, for example, the PABS Annex is not agreed at the World Health Assembly next year, the high-level meeting becomes a critical point for mobilising an advocacy around getting this done. I mean, in a way, I'm kind of hopeful that the momentum that's come from having a successful outcome to the text of the Accord might carry the PABS through, but it might not, and we might need the high-level meeting to build on that. So, if the PABS is agreed, then I think the high-level meeting needs to be catalytic in urging and mobilising countries and getting good statements from heads of state and so on around ratification, because you need 60 ratifications for this to come into effect. And that can take a while. You know, you don't want to take 3 years, right? You've got a new agreement, you've got an annex, you want some action. You don't want everyone sitting around for 3 years. And by the way, there's many things countries could be doing now to think, well, how will I implement what's coming down the track from the new pandemic agreement? So we should take the high-level meeting seriously. We should see it as a way of keeping a spotlight on pandemic preparedness and response. The truth is that the New York General Assembly Week attracts a great many heads of state and government. That's where you get their attention. Sadly, not so many come here to Geneva for a World Health Assembly, but they do go to New York. And so, you know, really mobilising to get commitments from that highest level of government there will be important.
Thank you so much. In the final 2 minutes, I'm just going to squeeze in another question. You spoke about what countries could be doing now. Can you give us examples of what countries could be doing now as we wait? I'm always worried that there's going to be a loss of momentum.
So one thing, of course, to be doing right now is ensuring countries are ready to run with the international health regulations revised, which take effect in September. But with the pandemic agreement, I would urge every member state to be going through it and looking at the new obligations that they've accepted and what it will take in national processes to comply with those. In the agreement, there's some shalls and there's a lot of shoulds and encourage and facilitate. And I guess it wasn't possible to get stronger language, but I would say to member states, do whatever you can to, you know, at least interpret a should as a shall in the way that you are implementing, because that can only be for the common good.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining me. It was such a treat to have you. I have to release Helen, unfortunately. She's got so much to do, but thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
And next up, still continuing with the podcast, we have Dr. Ngashi Ngongo, who's the Principal Advisor to the Director General on Program Management at the Africa CDC.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ngashi, for joining me. We've just spoken to Helen about the pandemic treaty, and I know before, during the negotiations, actually, Africa CDC sort of listed what their wish list was for the pandemic treaty. Does the text meet your expectations?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Um, Let me say that it is somehow to our expectations, but at the same time also to the realization that a global negotiation cannot give you everything that you want. I think that's the reason why we got stuck last year. We had to convene all our ministers of health, we convened all of them to come in Addis and say, do you know what? The world is big. It's not only about Africa. It's not about only about what we want. I think somehow there are also things that we can let go and things that we can gain. But in the main, I think we have gotten most of the things that we wanted, whether it's on One Health, on financing. I think a lot have been done, on the equity and fairness in, and access to medical countermeasures. I think we've gotten most of what we wanted. The most important for us, what is left, is the PABs. As you know, that whole thing about the sharing the pathogens and also ensuring that the benefits are also shared is where really we haven't really gotten, and we all hope that the discussions that will continue in the next 12 months will get to a point that we will be able to get what we want to get out of it.
I want to come back to PUBs because that's been a really contentious issue. But then one thing you mentioned was convening ministers of health, African ministers of health. And one thing that's been shared a lot is how the African bloc was able to negotiate as a unified force during this pandemic treaty. And Africa CDC really played a role in convening those ministers and in getting people together. How important was that to act together? And what do you think were the results of us pushing together? I'm like us because I was like in there, you're doing it for me as well.
Yes, I think it made a big difference. One of the main difficulties that we have is that we had the representatives of the African negotiations here based in Geneva that did not work directly with the political leadership on the continent. The first thing that we did, that we sent a technical team of Africa CDC to come and sit here in Geneva and support them. And then we realized that they were contacting their ministers, unilaterally, without having, a consented, a voice of the entire continent. And then, can you imagine when you talk to your minister, the minister says he doesn't agree, and you bring that to the common. And I talk to my minister says, no, as we agree, as a continent, that did not help us. That's when Africa CDC said, no. If that's the case, let's start first with the ministers, because they're the ones that are instructing the negotiators that are seated in Geneva. That's when we convened them. After that meeting, it was a heated meeting. But at the end, really the consensus was that we cannot go in a negotiation and expect that it's only us. There are others also that do have their right, they also have what they want to gain, and then let's agree as the collective on a common voice. That's the common voice that they took forward. And then we can now see the result is that at least the first part of the negotiation is done. We are only hoping that we'll continue also on the same for the remaining, perhaps most difficult part on the PUBs.
Yeah, I want to talk about that difficult part, PUBs, because this has been contentious. I experienced the pandemic in Africa. I was there the whole time, and being last in line to receive vaccines, therapeutics is hard. And we got to a point, I live in Botswana, we got to a point where we had the money to buy vaccines, but we couldn't access vaccines. And we got to a point where citizens were angry. They're like, why can't we do this? Why can't you do this for us? And so I want to talk about PUBs and what the hope is for Africa CDC. What does the Africa Bloc want to come out of this next phase of negotiations?
I think there are two things. There are many things, but I can summarize at least two most important ones. One is that when we do share the pathogens, we share the information, the genetic sequencing, everything that is needed to be able to develop whether the diagnostics or the vaccines or the treatment. Our expectation is that in return, we also need to get a share of the product that has been developed. So we don't go through the same what we went through during COVID. And right now, I'm also leading the mpox continental response. We've also gotten to a point where right now we have no vaccines. It is always the same thing. Now, we are looking at it from two angles. One is that the first part is to get a share. What was suggested is to get 20%, of the medical countermeasure to be also given for free, back as a contribution. That in a way, if you read the document now, the annex, what it is saying, it still keeps the 20%, but not everything for free, but 10% for free, another 10% at preferential price. It's already a step forward. I think, as I said, you can't get everything that you want the way you want it. I think somehow there is a compromise.
I'm a pessimist. When you say that, I was like, that's a step back.
No. It's a good compromise. In a way, we get half of what we wanted, and we have a plus, on something else. The negotiations are ongoing. We still have 12 months to go. The second thing that we also want is also to be able to support the tech transfer so that the commodities are also produced in Africa through our local manufacturing agenda. That is what remained really unsorted out. That area is gray. Until now, we are hoping that we'll be able to negotiate that. If I give you an example, you look at the mpox now. We received mpox, I think, thanks to the global solidarity. Excellent assistance. We received close to 1.3 million doses of mpox that was donated before. But now, if you look at the cost of one dose of mpox is $65. Now, even if we negotiated a preferential price, $65 for countries that the annual health expenditure is below $50 per capita. Do you think those countries can afford to buy mpox? They won't. That's the reason why one of the things we also want is that if there could be tech transfer, then we work to produce those commodities locally, and then with the continental food procurement mechanism that we have already established. You remember the head of state last year decided to establish this mechanism through Africa CDC to allow African countries to put their demands, their procurement together, create the volumes that we need to be able to negotiate better pricing. Because with the manufacturer, the price depends on the quantity. The more you buy, I think the better you can negotiate the price. All those are things that we are negotiating, and we want to see that also addressed in the annex by next year.
Okay. And then speaking of mpox, I know one thing that you guys have been doing is working together with WHO to address the mpox outbreak, which brings me to like a really important issue that's in discussion right now at WHA, which is WHO's budget, the funding shortfalls, the organization needing to slim down. How will that affect Africa CDC and also like responses to outbreaks on the continent?
I think everybody knows that the cuts at WHO will have an impact on the work that we could expect from WHO. Because right now, if you heard what Dr. Tedros said, you remember the last biennium budget was 6.8 billion. Now what he presented there is 4.2 billion. And then that of the 4.2 for the next biennium, that's 26-27, they only have 2.6 billion. They are now also working hard to mobilize the remaining 1.6 billion. Now, that's WHO. If you look at it in reality, WHO reduced to almost 1/3 of its capacity, its financial capacity, if they don't mobilize additional funding. Can you imagine the role that WHO has played in the past, in emergency responses and the universal health coverage? They won't get the same capacity, both technically, financially, logistically, and so on. They will be reduced big time, and everybody has to pay for that. But then, what we are also saying can help. If you look at the way that we responded to mpox response this time, we changed the whole thing for the very first time. We went through Ebola 2014, 2015, we went through COVID. Now, with mpox, we decided to establish one single unified coordination mechanism on the continent. That's what I'm leading, with my colleague from WHO. That all of us come together, and then we can also articulate the issues of efficiencies and duplication. We agree in surveillance. Who is the best in surveillance? That person leads on surveillance. The best in laboratory leads on laboratory. In a way, we started already thinking about the most efficient way of managing limited resources and ensuring that there is synergy and complementation, there is no duplication. That, in a way, will help, but it still cannot really substitute the big cut that WHO has gone through. I think we very much support all effort, really, through the member state assessed contributions. I think Dr. Tedros said that it is true we understand, but at the same time, it's also time that the member state also step up their contribution to be able to fill some of these gaps.
Yeah, this is a question that I asked Helen earlier about the global health architecture, that people are talking about a need for change, and I think we're also forced to change. And in Africa, I think that's a big push that we're having. What do you think this new architecture should look like, and what would you like it to see, and what kind of changes would you like to see in terms of like just the architecture?
That is a very difficult question. I would say that there are some realities. If I sit myself from the continental perspective where I'm seated, and then I'm looking at the global health architecture, few things. One is that we are seeing some of the regional institutions also ascending, taking a much bigger role. That means that the former roles have to be revisited. You know, that, for example, do we still need WHO to be also conducting the operations, or WHO can now focus on normative work and so on? Those are the things that we need to revisit in the current context. The second thing is that when we look at the global health initiatives themselves, there's a lot of duplication. There are many, many organizations that do the exact same thing. And if it's women's health, you have UNFPA, you have women, UN Women. I think it is time, truly speaking, to consider also streamlining some of those roles. So instead of having 3, 4, 5 organizations doing the same and competing for the same funding, when funding is no more available, also bring it together. The third thing that not long ago we had the Lusaka Agenda, which also reviewed how these global organizations and global initiatives should be working. More and more to break on the fragmentation, we all support the Lusaka Agenda recommendations that partners need to come together, bring their resources together, and align behind national priorities. What was happening? We are doing an assessment of the impact of the recent cuts in Africa. We discovered something. I think we'll be publishing the data in the coming weeks. It's about $8 billion lost in Africa if these cuts continue the way they are. But of the $8 billion that we are losing, it's only $2 billion that went through the government system that we can all account for. The rest of the money went through NGOs with no information shared with the government. Now, how do we then account for $6 billion that go through NGOs? What the NGOs do, no one knows exactly whether they contributed to the national plan or not. I think those are some of the things that we really need to change, realizing that we really need some deep reflection and changes into the way that we, the global health organizations, have operated in the past.
Like you say, difficult questions with potentially painful solutions.
That's exactly what it is.
Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Ngashi. I really enjoyed this conversation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.